morning, and thank you so much for coming to tonight's Spectator Speaker Series event. I'm Isabel Hardman. I'm the assistant editor at The Spectator, and I'm going to be your host for this evening, which is delightful because we have a very special night lined up. Now, as many of you know, last Monday was the 100th birthday of one of the most important politicians of the last century, Margaret Thatcher. Winner of 3 general elections, she transformed British politics, leaving a lasting legacy with profound and lasting consequences. Her life, her philosophy, and her private circle have been widely documented and the subject of intense speculation, including this week. And there's arguably no one better positioned to speak on Margaret Thatcher's enduring legacy than our special guest tonight. In 1990, Charles Moore, now chairman of The Spectator, was personally chosen by Thatcher herself to write her official biography. Granted unprecedented access to her private correspondence and inner circle, Moore conducted over 600 interviews across 22 years. And the result is a monumental 3-volume work spanning more than 3,000 pages, widely regarded as the definitive account of her life and career. Charles very recently published a condensed version, condensed by his standards, I think it's fair to say, and signed copies of which many of you bought with your tickets this evening. Now, later this evening, you and I are going to have a chance to delve into Charles's extraordinary journey and ask him questions directly. But first, we're in for something very exciting and a little different. So for the first part of tonight's event, Charles will take to the stage in a 50-minute semi-dramatisation of the Fall of Margaret Thatcher, a whodunit. Now, just to clarify, he's not going to be playing Thatcher himself. That role goes to the brilliant Kate Ehrman, who worked alongside Charles for the 3 volumes of his biography and works for Garsington Opera. We'll then have a short interval and we'll reconvene for an extended question and answer session. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to tonight's stars, Charles Moore and Kate Ehrman.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Isabel. I need, first of all, to do a sort of word of explanation for this evening. When I was writing the book, the 3rd volume, in fact, I realized that the story of Margaret Thatcher's fall was half Greek tragedy and half whodunit, and that it made a very good drama in itself. And I've given many, hundreds and hundreds of talks about Mrs. Thatcher in various guises, and I thought actually it would be interesting to do something different and to dramatize, or semi-dramatize, we're not dressed up, we're not wearing makeup, etc., these few days, and hence what we're doing tonight. And I realized, of course, that I didn't want to get actors to all the parts, but I definitely did need Mrs. Thatcher. And I thought of Kate, who has a very nice voice, as you will hear, and who Isabel mentioned the 600 interviews. One of the main tasks Kate performed for me, which is extraordinarily a tiring task, is that if you've interviewed 600 people and you need to get in touch afterwards with those who are still alive to check the quotes they've given you before you print them. Otherwise, they may be upset that they're misrepresented in some way. So Kate had to go right through all of them, saying, "Oh well, perhaps I didn't mean that," or whatever. So anyway, we got that done, and we put this together. And the point about it is, some of you will have seen things like The Crown, in which Mrs. Thatcher features, and while I admit that our production values are not as good as those of The Crown, I think that we offer something which all these things don't, which is that the dialogue you're going to hear is 100% real. I haven't made up a single word of it. It's all what people told me they said, which, by the way, might not be true, of course, but I mean, what they told me they said, what they said in their diaries or letters at the time, what they said on television, what they said in Parliament, and so on. And so I think it does try to convey quite strongly what's really, what it was actually like. And as a historian, I have a pedantic rage whenever I see these representations of history where, you know they're jolly well making it up. A couple of little warnings, please. First of all, what people now call a trigger warning. There are phrases here which may distress more tender, the more tender Spectator readers, if there are any. But my excuse is that these are not my words, and I come back to the point that they were actually said by the dramatis personae. And the other thing is about accents. Kate has pretty much only to perform one person. It's not quite true, but nearly, because obviously this is, as the whole of Margaret Thatcher's career was, a story all about men, with one very important exception, which was her. And but I have to do all the voices of all the men. And so in order to differentiate the voices, I have to do different accents, so apologies about that. And I do them in two different ways. One is, sometimes they are actually, try to be anyway, characteristic of the person you've probably heard of. And sometimes there are people you haven't heard of, and I simply need to differentiate each one a bit so that you don't get in a total muddle. So forgive me and indulge me and be generous. So first of all, in this Whodunnit, let me remind you of the main characters. Needs no introduction, but do you know when that is, when she's standing there?
Yeah,
day she resigned, quite right. And you may remember that she announced her resignation, and by ill luck for Labour, they had were moving a no-confidence motion that day, which they would have thought would be good, but it was bad, because it gave her this tremendous opportunity to defend her whole record. And so despite her misery, she was actually incredibly happy at that moment, and you can see how strong she looks, how well made up and presented, and she doesn't look at all, not showing the inner misery at all. Next, that of course is Dennis, and actually it's an untypical pose because he wasn't really a champagne man, he was whiskey or gin and tonic. I love this picture. You will know, this is a slightly earlier date actually, you will know that every year the Sovereign has the Prime Minister to stay at the end of August in Balmoral, beginning of September. And that this was given me by Andrew Parker Bowles, the former husband of the present Queen, who took it. And I think it's charming because you can see, first of all, they're looking happy. Secondly, Her Majesty is obviously more used to the Aberdeenshire weather than Mrs. Thatcher. Very nice tweed suit she's got, as always, very careful with her dress, but less suitable, I think, for D side. And I like the way, and obviously the wind is causing trouble for her hair. And I like the way the corgi is looking away. And then this is her cabinet. I won't, of course, go through them, but this is essentially, not quite, but almost her final cabinet. She made a few tiny changes at the very end. Only point to emphasize, which a picture emphasizes, only one woman there. And then, who's that? Yes, I've delivered this, we've delivered this to different audiences, and so I'm going to try the quiz on you, but you're going to get all the answers right, which is not always the case. And the problem, Geoffrey Howe, of course, had been what Richard Ryder called the tapestry master of Thatcherism, and he's very, very important in the early days, but they'd increasingly fallen out, partly about Europe and partly for sort of temperamental reasons. And Mrs. Thatcher didn't really like the sort of demeanor of Geoffrey Howe, and she was very conscious of people's bodies and manner and so on, and she thought he was too sort of blobby and mild and mumbly, and she didn't really like that. And I can see, if you look at her face now when she's listening to it, you can see. And she had removed him from the Foreign Secretaryship the year before and demoted him to being leader of the House, and therefore he was basically in a very bad mood with in fact, as you will remember, fatal results. Who is this? Yeah. Again, this is not a contemporaneous photograph, not 1990. This is when Michael Heseltine was still in the cabinet before he resigned over Westland, but in 4 years running up to where we are tonight, he was on the backbenches, essentially hoping he could succeed from trying to work how best to do it. And then, Ken Baker. Douglas Hurd, on the left of the party, pro-European, not at all a Thatcherite, but not one of nature's plotters, and somebody who Mrs. Thatcher respected. He was at this point Foreign Secretary. And on the on your right, Ken Baker, the party chairman, an ex officio, therefore a supporter, and I think in actual fact a supporter of Margaret Thatcher. And finally, in this lineup of the main characters, sorry, I've got everyone's had a cough recently, including me, and I'm not infectious anymore. John Major, had briefly been Foreign Secretary and was now Chancellor of the Exchequer. So the main events that we are narrating tonight took place over 3 very intense days in November 1990. But first, I just want to take you back very quickly to the year before, November 89, when she was challenged for the leadership. Who by? Yes, Sir Anthony Mayer, a very obscure, amiable backbencher, left-wing, pro-European, anti-Thatcher, and he was considered to be the stalking horse for Michael Heseltine, to see what the level of support was. And he was sometimes called the stalking donkey. And the thing was that Mrs. Thatcher easily defeated Mayer in this, but it was nevertheless a significant challenge because it had never happened before, and it brought out certain feelings. And this person was important in this. Quite right, Tristan Garel-Jones. In this story, as is often the case in politics, there are a few people who the world hasn't heard of who are actually important nevertheless. They were behind the scenes. He'd been a whip, Tristan, for a very long time, deputy chief whip. And in 1889, he was still deputy chief whip. And as such, he helped to run Mrs. Thatcher's campaign to be re-elected. And it was, as I say, successful. But he was worried. And by the way, he was himself anti-Thatcher, on the left of the party, pro-European. But it was his job to support Mrs. Thatcher in this campaign, and I think he did. And so he went to her, and he visited her in Downing Street, and he told me that he said to her, "You've won easily this time, but remember, there are 100 assassins lurking in the bushes." And he analyzed the situation much more frankly in a secret message to the chief whip, who is this person. Tim Renton, correct. And this was almost fatal. His appointment was almost fatal to Mrs. Thatcher. She made it when she demoted Geoffrey Howe as compensation to Geoffrey Howe because he was a great friend of Howe. So that was a mistake from her point of view. And also, Renton had no experience of whipping, so he was actually useless, not a useless man, but useless in the job. And it was really Garel-Jones, who by 1990 had moved to be a European minister, but this we're still talking about 89, was advising. And I found this letter in Tim Renton's papers, which he kindly showed me. And I think it tells you a lot about what was really being thought by Garel-Jones. So what Garel-Jones said to Renton is, "I believe this is the beginning of the end for Mrs. Thatcher." This is 1989. "The job of the whip's office is to try to manage that end in a way that does not split the party. This means avoiding the daylight assassination of the Prime Minister by her enemies. Heseltine will run next year, so all the ingredients exist for a fight, unless," and he wrote, "unless, ... And I think what he meant was, we who are her ministers but are fed up with her, do think it's time for her to go, but we're damned if Heseltine's going to get it. We've been bearing the heat and burden of the day, and us lot, want to arrange the succession. And therefore, that's what he was sort of imagining in 1989. Okay, so nearly a year later, November 1990, and the situation for Mrs. Thatcher was much worse, because she was beset by unpopularity over the poll tax and cabinet-level rows about Europe. And on the 1st of November, she made an angry statement in Parliament about the European summit she'd just attended in Rome. Expressing her opposition to European integration, she uttered the famous words,
"No, no, no."
This so upset Geoffrey Howe, the strongest pro-European in the cabinet, that he resigned. And there was renewed speculation that a challenger, Michael Heseltine, would now come forward. And it was Howe's deadly resignation statement in the House on the 13th of November which lit the blue touch paper.
Heseltine sat behind Howe. He later recalled,
"I heard Geoffrey's chilling words. The time has now come for others to consider their own response to the tragic conflict of loyalties with which I have myself wrestled for so long."
Heseltine knew at this point that he must stand. After Howe's statement, Mrs. Thatcher walked to her parliamentary office behind the Speaker's chair, accompanied by John Major.
She was hurt, she was wounded, she was shaken. I think she realized it was self-inflicted. I'm a tactile person, and I reached across, taking both her hands in mine. She kept them there for a good deal of the conversation. Michael Heseltine formally announced his challenge the next day, and in those days you'll remember that the only voters in the leadership contest were MPs, and now it's the party as well. Mrs. Thatcher needed to win outright on the first ballot. If the contest dragged on to a second, the loyalty of her cabinet colleagues would be strained. And the first ballot was set for Tuesday the 20th of November. But what was so extraordinary was that she wasn't going to be there. She was not going to be in London, but in Paris for the grand gathering of world leaders, which was to mark the West's victory in the Cold War, in which she had played such an important part. And in her absence from Westminster, the plotting began. Now I want to introduce this person. Yes, Alan Clark, who was a junior minister at that time, not really known to the public at that time. Later, of course, famous for his diaries, which we in the trade knew he was writing, but the world didn't. They give a wonderful, irreverent, not wholly accurate account of events. Alan was a great admirer of Mrs. Thatcher, and I once asked him at the time, actually, whether he was in love with her. And he said, "I don't want actual penetration, just a massive snog."
Wednesday, the 14th of November, Alan Clark noticed a curious state of limbo in the Commons, which he considered damaging to Mrs. Thatcher's chances. Tristan Garel-Jones called Clark from his car and said he thought he could find a way to keep Heseltine out.
"As long as it works,"
said Clark.
"It's got to fucking work."
Garel-Jones affirmed. Saturday, the 17th of November, and Garel-Jones rang Clark. He said that Douglas Hurd would be in Paris with Mrs. Thatcher, and John Major would be at home near Huntingdon, recovering from an operation on 2 impacted wisdom teeth. The 2 men
"We'll speak to each other in that critical hour after the first ballot result on Tuesday and settle what should happen next."
Clark had a follow-up question.
"Look, all these arguments being tossed around on the assumption that we have to go to a second ballot. That's right, baby. If there's any uncertainty, a group of us are to meet at Catherine Place after the 10 p.m. vote that Tuesday."
Catherine Place was Garel-Jones's own house. His plan to manage the end of Mrs. Thatcher was now being put into action.
The 2 most senior figures in all this, which are Hurd and Major, were too senior to attend the meeting. And they both had hopes of beating Heseltine and succeeding Mrs. Thatcher. Both thought that their chances improved if they worked together. As Major said, "We were friends more than we were rivals."
Monday, the 19th of November, in the Commons, with Mrs. Thatcher in Paris, Alan Clark was growing anxious.
The savour of a Heseltine victory starts to pervade the crannies and cupboards and committee rooms. At the top of the ministerial staircase, I ran into Tristan Garel-Jones. He was bubbling with suppressed excitement. Tristan said, "Of course every member of the cabinet will vote for the Prime Minister in the first round." "Like hell they will." I said to him, hoping he'd deny it, "One cannot actually exclude the possibility that Heseltine will score more votes than her on the first ballot." "No, I'm afraid one can't." This was really chilling. Apocalypse.
Tuesday, the 20th of November.
Mrs. Thatcher waited in Paris for the results with the following people. Who is that? Charles Pole. this, of course, is a political story, not a government story, so there are very few civil servants involved. It's a party matter. But Charles Pole was her closest of all her professional civil servants. She'd almost imprisoned him in number 10. They normally do the stint for 3 years. He did it for 6. And he was so important to her, with her all the time, particularly, of course, on foreign affairs. And very typically there he is right beside her. Now, who's this? Yes, Crawford. Much later picture, of course, there they both are on holiday in Venice. Crawford, extraordinary lady who's still alive, and she worked as Mrs. Thatcher's sort of, you could say, maid of honor or something like that, and helping her in all sorts of ways about clothes, being with her a great deal of the time. Mustn't forget that being a woman prime minister, particularly in the sort of man's world, you must have a woman with you. There are all sorts of comforts you need, which you're not going to get from the men, and you need to be sort of understood in a particular way, I think. And Crawford worked for her, I think, from the 1970s until Mrs. Thatcher's death in 2013. So she was with her on this visit to Paris. And finally, who's that? Peter Morrison. And Morrison was her PPS, and therefore responsible for her campaign and for contact with Tory backbenchers. And he was very much a loyalist. But it was actually a very unsuitable appointment because, poor man, he had been, and I remember this at the time, rumors were spreading that he had committed paedophile offenses, and the police were spreading this behind the hand in a way that I'm afraid they sometimes do. I'm convinced that this was not true, that he hadn't. No evidence ever came forward. But what he was gay at a time when you weren't really supposed to say so. And so he was sort of embarrassed and ashamed and terribly worried about accusations, true or false. And as a result, he was drinking very, very heavily, I mean, appallingly heavily. And so he was really perfectly useless for this role at this time and an important part of the problem.
Pole, Crawford and Morrison were with Mrs. Thatcher, who was sitting at the dressing table in Peter Morrison's bedroom in the British Embassy. The results came through. It was 204 for Mrs. Thatcher, 152 for Heseltine, and 16 abstentions. She had just missed the threshold for victory on the first ballot. There would have to be a second. Out of the Prime Minister's line of sight, Pole made a thumbs down sign to Crawford and then realized that Mrs. Thatcher could see him in her mirror.
She could see my grimace. I'm sure she knew it was over.
Mrs. Thatcher descended to the courtyard where the BBC was waiting. She moved quickly to quell doubt. I can confirm that it is my intention to let my name go forward for the second ballot.
Mrs. Thatcher was now late for the banquet and ballet at Versailles, but President Mitterrand of France ensured that the occasion did not begin without her.
On the hurried car journey, Peter Morrison recalled that
her right arm leapt out and grabbed just above my left knee, and she dug her nails in quite painfully. And all she kept saying was,
"We must fight on. We must fight on. There's so much to do." Back in Westminster, the air was thick with conspiracy. As MPs gathered for the division that evening, John McGregor, the leader of the House, was sitting in his room, just yards from the chamber.
I became aware there were people outside who were clearly plotting. Tristan Garel-Jones was one of the main ones.
Garel-Jones started to round up a few selected colleagues and told Alan Clark,
"We're meeting at my house straight after this." "Who's we?"
asked Clark.
"Oh, just a few mates, Chris Patten and people." And there we are. Chris Patten, again, as all this story, it's the same, really. He was on the left of the party, anti-Thatcher and pro-European. But she had quite good personal relations with him, particularly because you may remember she made a great speech at the Royal Society and some subsequent ones, airing the theory of global warming for the first time. And he was her environment secretary, and he and she agreed on this point, and that was a sort of bond between them.
Garel-Jones told Clark,
"We need to talk through the next steps." "How do you mean?" "Ways of supporting the Prime Minister,"
he said, choosing his words carefully.
At Catherine Place, those present were unanimous, except for Clark, that the Prime Minister must go. 5 were cabinet ministers of the generation below Mrs. Thatcher. The question was who should stop Heseltine and succeed her. almost all those attending supported either Hurd or Major. And although Major denied that any campaign for him was in progress, this man was already, in fact, its manager. And that, of course, is... Gosh, sorry, it's got rather close up. Yes, Norman Lamont had just become just joined the cabinet as chief secretary, and of course later became, as a reward, I guess, Major's Chancellor of the Exchequer, and it all got a bit nasty later. The meeting decided that the best way to reduce Heseltine's vote in the second ballot was for both Hurd and Major to stand, and then the more successful might ultimately win. Each would see the other's supporters right.
The 5 cabinet ministers duly went to Parliament from Catherine Place to report their conclusions to Tim Renton, the chief whip. With Renton was this man.
Who's that? Yes, Alistair Goodlad, deputy chief whip at this point, and another of these people who's important behind the scenes and hardly ever emerged from behind the scenes. He kept a very good note, which he kindly showed me, of what actually happened, which I will shortly quote from.
Goodlad noted their view.
Prime Minister probably would not win, and even if she did, she could not carry on. When asked if they were prepared to give the Prime Minister the same message directly, they demurred amongst some foot shuffling.
Leaving the banquet in Versailles, Mrs. Thatcher was fearful of the overwhelming attentions of the press. Seeing that she was alone, without Dennis, President George Bush turned to his wife Barbara and said,
"There's Margaret. Maybe we should go with her."
She said to Bush, "Now don't worry, George. I'll go home and get this straight." In her memoirs, she described his gesture. This was one of those little acts of kindness which remind us that even power politics is not just about power. Returning to the British Embassy, Mrs. Thatcher retired to her room, but did not feel like sleep. She spent the night talking to Crawfey. And the next morning, Crawfey did Mrs. Thatcher's hair and helped her apply extra makeup to her face, because everyone thinks you're going to be a sad little person. On Wednesday, the 21st of November, at 8:20 in the morning, Tim Renton was surprised by the press as he scurried up and down Claiborne Mews SW1s. He was trying to find this person's front door.
Yes, smile of recognition, a noise of recognition. Willie Whitelaw, who by this time she'd made a Viscount, so he had retired from frontline politics, but he remained he challenged against her, not challenged, but he stood when she won, and he had lost, and he ever after served her loyally. Again, on the left of the party, pro-European, not sort of her type of person, but he was very valuable to her because he, like the beer, he reached the parts that she couldn't reach. And it was considered a repository of wisdom in the Conservative Party, so if anything big internally was happening, you needed to find out what Willie thought.
Once Renton had got inside, the two men discussed over breakfast what message he should convey from Whitelaw to Mrs. Thatcher. Whitelaw said there was
a danger of her being humiliated in the second ballot.
If she won by a low margin, Whitelaw continued,
she will not be able to unite the party as the sniping will go on.
Whitelaw was happy for Renton to report this to her, but he did not dare tell Mrs. Thatcher to her face. The fact of the chief whip consulting the tribal elder would make it obvious enough that Mrs. Thatcher was in deep trouble. The Whitelaw effect was swift.
William Hague, funnily enough, was already famous because he made that famous speech age 16 in the 1970s at the Tory party conference. But he recently got into Parliament and rose immediately. So he'd only come in, came in a by-election, I think, the year before, but now he was Norman Lamont's PPS, so he was already understood what was going on in a way that very few other MPs did at this moment.
A colleague reported Hague's view that
there's a massive withdrawal of support from the Prime Minister, and she'll have to back down before the day is out as a result of pressure from people like Willie Whitelaw.
Hague was getting geared up to help organise the John Major campaign. Earlier that morning, Alistair Goodlad met this man by arrangement.
Who's that? Wakeham, yeah. and John Wakeham, who had been the chief whip, and it was probably the most successful backroom fixer of the era. Just to think to, and at this point he was Secretary of State for Energy, just to bear in mind such an important feature of the Thatcher years that the Brighton bomb of 1984, and they were punctuated by very great atrocities, really, including against Mrs. Thatcher and her colleagues. So just before she became Prime Minister in 1979, the INLA blew up her chief aide and killed him, Airy Neve. Then there was a Brighton bomb, and then at the very end of her time, her much beloved former PPS, Ian Gow, was killed. In the 1984 Brighton bomb, John Wakeham's first wife was killed, and he himself nearly lost the use of his legs. And this is partly why he was close to Goodlad, because when he was recovering after it, he lived widowed and, at that time, crippled. He lived with the Goodlads, and so he had a very close relationship, and they confided very much in one another.
Wakeham told Goodlad he
was sure the Prime Minister could go forward as she thought she could win,
but he had little to say about helping her to do so. Instead, he remarked that
there are only two ways of getting rid of a sitting Prime Minister: a vote of confidence by the House of Commons or by the Cabinet.
So he and she needed to know what Cabinet ministers thought. Wakeham was chatting to colleagues in his Commons ministerial room when this man entered.
Again, left of the party, pro-European, Ken Clarke, but actually had quite a good relationship with Mrs. Thatcher because he spoke his mind, which she liked, and she just promoted him, actually, and she felt that he was a good and effective minister.
Clarke said,
"She hasn't a chance, she's got to go."
In Paris, Mrs. Thatcher spent a politically unproductive morning at the conference. Alan Clark, trying to get through to warn her about the result of the Catherine Place meeting the night before, was blocked by Peter Morrison. Morrison.
There's a working breakfast.
Clark.
With a lot of fucking foreigners, I suppose.
I hope you're enjoying the event. If you want to continue watching, you'll have to be a Spectator subscriber. If you're still not signed up, fear not. You can subscribe in seconds and get 3 months for £3. You'll be getting access to the world's greatest magazine with daily commentary, newsletters, and access to exclusive subscriber events like this. So sign up right now at spectator.co.uk/live and don't miss another moment.